Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back, way back, to a time before borders, before passports, before anyone looked at a giant continent and said, yes, this will definitely be mine. So dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, get comfortable, let the room go quiet. Because tonight we're not chasing battles or dramatic conquests. We're simply floating across thousands of years of human history, slowly, gently, with only mild existential dread. We're talking about the indigenous peoples of America, the first Americans, the communities who built civilizations, raised cities, traded across mountains, mapped rivers by memory, and developed complex cultures long before anyone in Europe had even heard the word America. And like many stories in history, this one begins with a very long walk. A very, very long walk. Most scholars agree that the earliest ancestors of Native Americans arrived from Northeast Asia during the last Ice Age, not in a dramatic fleet of ships, not with trumpets, just families, small groups, moving slowly. During the height of the Ice Age, sea levels were much lower. This exposed a vast stretch of land connecting what we now call Siberia and Alaska. That land bridge is known as Beringia. Beringia was not a tiny strip of sand. It was enormous, a cold, wind-swept landscape of grasslands and tundra. Mammoths roamed, bison wandered, and humans followed dinner, because humans have always followed dinner. These early migrants did not know they were entering a new world. They were simply adapting, surviving, walking forward because the climate changed, or the herds moved, or perhaps because someone said, "Let's see what's over there." By around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, people had spread into North America, and over thousands of years they continued southward, eventually reaching Central America, then South America, all the way to the southern tip of the continent. No one planted a flag, no one drew a border. They just lived. Now here is where things get quietly impressive. Because when we talk about indigenous Americans, we are not talking about one culture, not one language, not one identity. We are talking about thousands of distinct nations, with their own traditions, their own beliefs, their own political systems, their own architectural styles, probably. In North America alone, before European contact, there were hundreds of tribes. Among them were the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee in the northeast, the Cherokee Nation in the southeast, the Navajo Nation in the southwest, and many, many more. Each group adapted to its environment in remarkably sophisticated ways. In the Arctic regions, the Inuit developed technologies for surviving brutal cold, seal hunting, snow houses, fur clothing layered with mathematical precision. Further south, in the Pacific Northwest, nations such as the Tlingit thrived along coastlines rich in salmon. They carved towering totem poles, built plank houses, established complex clan systems tied to inheritance and status. Down in the Great Plains, communities followed the migration of buffalo. Their societies were mobile, deeply connected to the land and the animals that sustained them. And in the Southwest, something extraordinary was happening. Around what is now Arizona and New Mexico, the ancestors of the Hopi tribe and the ancestral Puebloans built intricate stone dwellings into cliffs. One of the most famous examples is Cliff Palace, a vast complex of rooms carved into sandstone alcoves, carefully designed, thoughtfully arranged. It was not random survival. It was architecture. And while North America developed in these varied, decentralized ways, Mesoamerica was quietly building cities, massive ones. Let's gently float south into what is now Mexico and Central America.
Here, civilizations arose with pyramids, writing systems, calendars, and astronomy that would make medieval Europe blink in confusion. The Maya civilization constructed vast urban centers like Tikal. These were not villages, they were cities with temples, plazas, and road networks. The Maya developed one of the most advanced writing systems in the ancient Americas. They charted the movements of Venus. They calculated solar cycles with astonishing accuracy.
And yes, they also had their share of royal drama, because humans everywhere, regardless of geography, love a good dynasty. Meanwhile, in central Mexico, the powerful Aztec Empire established their capital at Tenochtitlan. Built on an island in Lake Texcoco, it was a marvel of engineering. Causeways connected it to the mainland. Aqueducts supplied fresh water. Markets buzzed with trade. When Europeans first saw Tenochtitlan in the 16th century, some compared it favorably to cities back home, which must have been humbling. Further south still, in the Andes, another empire quietly managed steep mountains with bureaucratic efficiency. The Inca Empire stretched across what is now Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and beyond. They built roads through mountains, suspension bridges over gorges, terraced farms climbing hillsides. Their famous citadel, Machu Picchu, still rests high in the Andes. Stone blocks fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. No mortar, no cement, just careful craftsmanship. And while Europe often viewed these societies through a lens of discovery, the reality was far more complicated. Because the Americas were not empty. They were full of trade networks, diplomacy, rivalries, alliances, spiritual traditions deeply rooted in land and ancestry. Many indigenous belief systems centered around balance, harmony with nature, cycles of life and death. For example, among the Haudenosaunee, political governance was built around a confederacy model. The great law of peace guided decision-making. Clan mothers held significant authority in selecting leaders. Yes, clan mothers. Meanwhile, in parts of the southeast, complex mound-building societies flourished long before European arrival. At Cahokia, near present-day Illinois, a massive urban center existed around 1050 CE. It featured large earthen mounds, plazas, and evidence of long-distance trade. Cahokia may have housed tens of thousands of people at its height. That's not a small village, that's a city. And yet, for centuries, mainstream narratives downplayed or ignored these achievements. Early European colonists often described the land as wilderness, overlooking the managed landscapes, agricultural systems, and established settlements already in place. Because history is sometimes written by those who arrive last and speak the loudest. But tonight, we're not rushing toward colonization. We're staying here, in this long stretch of pre-contact life. Because for thousands of years, indigenous nations thrived. They adapted to deserts, forests, tundra, mountains, and coastlines. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, in agricultural systems that enriched the soil naturally. They developed oral traditions to preserve history, stories passed from elders to children, not written on paper, but carried in memory. And memory can be very durable. Social structures varied widely. Some societies were matrilineal, tracing descent through mothers. Others were more patriarchal. Some were highly stratified with nobles and commoners. Others emphasized communal decision-making. There was no single indigenous experience.
Just as Europe was not one culture, neither was the Americas. And that diversity is important to sit with. Because when we use broad labels like Native American or Indigenous, we are grouping together people who might have had as much in common with each other as medieval France did with Mongolia. Which is to say, not always much. Languages alone numbered in the hundreds. Entire language families flourished, complex grammars, rich vocabularies describing local landscapes in ways no outsider could fully grasp. Imagine knowing the land so well that you have distinct words for 10 different kinds of snow, or for the precise moment when a river begins to thaw. That is intimacy with place, and that intimacy shaped identity. For many indigenous communities, land was not property, it was relationship, a living presence, a source of life and spiritual meaning, which would later create unmisunderstandings. But again, we are not there yet. For now, we remain in a world where trade routes stretched across continents, where turquoise from the southwest traveled hundreds of miles, where shells from the Gulf Coast appeared far inland. Networks existed long before European ships crossed the Atlantic. And life moved in cycles. Seasons guided activity. Ceremonies marked transitions. Birth, adulthood, marriage, death, each held meaning within community frameworks. There were conflicts, of course. No human society exists without disagreement. Alliances shifted, wars occurred, captives were taken. But these conflicts existed within established norms and diplomatic traditions. This was not chaos, it was civilization, just differently organized. As we continue, we'll gently move toward the moment when European arrival begins to reshape everything, slowly, relentlessly, often tragically. But for now, let's sit a little longer with the depth and richness of indigenous America before contact. A continent not waiting to be discovered, but already very much alive.
All right, let's gently drift forward. We've been resting in a world that is full, complex, established, busy in its own quiet rhythms, trade routes humming, ceremonies unfolding with the seasons, children growing up in cliff dwellings, longhouses, and thatched homes beside rivers that had been known for thousands of years. And then sails appear. Not everywhere at once, not in some dramatic synchronized moment, just here and there, along coastlines, on islands, strange shapes on the water. In 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean under the sponsorship of the Spanish crown. He believed he had reached islands off Asia. He had not. Geography was about to become very awkward for everyone involved. When Columbus encountered the Taíno people in the Caribbean, he described them as generous and open. He also immediately noted how easily they might be controlled, which is not a promising start. The Taíno, like so many indigenous communities, had their own political systems, agricultural practices, and spiritual traditions. They cultivated cassava, they fished, they lived in organized villages under local leaders known as caciques. But Columbus and those who followed were not arriving as curious tourists. They were representatives of expanding empires. And empires tend to want things. Gold, in particular. Spain soon launched further expeditions. Conquistadors followed, carrying not only swords and armor, but something far more devastating: diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza.
Illnesses that had circulated in Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries suddenly entered populations with no prior exposure. The results were catastrophic. Entire communities were weakened before they even understood what was happening. It wasn't dramatic battle scenes that caused the greatest destruction. It was invisible microbes. Let's float north for a moment. Along the eastern coasts of what would become the United States, European powers began establishing colonies. England, France, the Netherlands, all eager to claim territory. In 1607, the English founded Jamestown. Nearby lived the Powhatan Confederacy, a network of Algonquian-speaking communities under the leadership of Chief Powhatan. Initial encounters were cautious. Trade occurred. Corn was exchanged. Information was shared. And then tensions rose, because when one group views land as shared stewardship and another views it as private property, misunderstandings are not just possible, they are guaranteed. Further north, in 1620, English pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower. They landed in lands already inhabited by the Wampanoag people. The Wampanoag had recently endured devastating epidemics, likely brought by earlier European fishermen and traders. Their population had been dramatically reduced, which changed the balance of power in ways no one could fully control. For a brief time, cooperation was practical. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, formed an alliance with the English settlers of Plymouth. There was diplomacy, shared harvests, mutual defense against rival groups. It was not a simple story of harmony, but neither was it immediate warfare. History tends to flatten these moments into symbols. Thanksgiving becomes a neat narrative, but the reality was layered, strategic, tense beneath the surface. Meanwhile, in the southwest, Spanish expeditions pushed northward from Mexico. In 1598, Juan de Oñate led settlers into what is now New Mexico, encountering Pueblo communities whose ancestors had built places like Cliff Palace centuries earlier. Spanish colonization brought missions, forced labor systems, and efforts at religious conversion, which did not always go smoothly. In 1680, Pueblo leaders organized a coordinated uprising against Spanish rule. Known today as the Pueblo Revolt, it successfully expelled the Spanish from the region for over a decade. This was not passive resistance. It was organized, strategic, effective. Let's float back to the Great Lakes and Northeast. Here, French traders established relationships with indigenous nations such as the Huron-Wendat Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The fur trade became central. Beaver pelts were in high demand in Europe. Trade brought goods, metal tools, firearms, textiles. It also brought dependency and competition. Access to European weapons shifted power dynamics between indigenous nations. Long-standing rivalries intensified. Wars, such as the Beaver Wars of the 16th century, reshaped the region. And through all of this, indigenous communities were not simply reacting, they were negotiating, strategizing, forming alliances with European powers when useful. They were adapting, because adaptation had always been part of survival. But the scale of change was unprecedented. Population decline from disease continued throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. In some regions, it is estimated that indigenous populations dropped by as much as 70 to 90% within a century. Let that settle for a moment. Entire knowledge systems, oral histories, skilled artisans, farmers, healers, lost in a generation. And yet, cultures endured. Languages were still spoken. Ceremonies continued. Children were raised with stories of ancestors stretching back beyond memory. Even as European colonies expanded, indigenous nations maintained sovereignty in many regions for centuries. Treaties were signed, boundaries negotiated, though those treaties would often be broken later, because consistency was not always a colonial strength. As the 18th century approached, the continent had become a patchwork of indigenous nations and European colonies, sometimes cooperating, often clashing, always watching one another. The story is not of immediate disappearance, it is one of transformation, of resilience, of loss and survival unfolding simultaneously. And through it all, indigenous peoples of the Americas remained what they had always been, deeply connected to land, community, and memory. The horizon had changed, the ships had come, but the story was far from over.
All right, let's keep drifting. By the 1700s, the map of North America looked less like a blank canvas and more like a crowded table where too many empires were reaching for the same plate of land. Spain controlled vast territories in the Southwest and Florida. France claimed enormous stretches of the interior through New France. Britain clung tightly to colonies along the Atlantic coast, and threaded through all of it were indigenous nations, not passive background figures, but political powers in their own right. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee had become master diplomats. Their confederacy, composed of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora, practiced a complex system of consensus governance under the Great Law of Peace. While European monarchs were busy insisting on divine rights and absolute authority, the Haudenosaunee were holding councils, debating policy, and carefully balancing clan influence. Clan mothers selected male chiefs. Decisions required discussion, not impulsive declarations. It was remarkably stable. Meanwhile, in the Southeast, nations like the Cherokee Nation were navigating a rapidly changing world. Trade with British colonists had brought firearms and manufactured goods, but also debt and land pressure. And land pressure was becoming relentless. European settlement was not slowing down, it was accelerating. By the mid-18th century, the rivalry between Britain and France exploded into open conflict in North America. The French and Indian War, part of the larger 7 Years' War, forced indigenous nations to choose sides or attempt neutrality in a war that did not originate with them. Some allied with the French, others with the British. These alliances were strategic. Indigenous leaders weighed who would offer better trade terms, fewer settlers, stronger military support. It was diplomacy in a dangerous moment. When Britain ultimately defeated France in 1763, it gained control of French territories east of the Mississippi River. On paper, this looked like a British victory. In practice, it removed a balancing power. Without the French presence, British colonists felt emboldened to expand westward into indigenous lands. Indigenous nations, suddenly facing a single dominant colonial power, grew uneasy. One prominent leader during this period was Pontiac, an Ottawa war chief who led a resistance movement against British forts in the Great Lakes region. The conflict, often called Pontiac's War, revealed how deeply indigenous nations opposed unchecked colonial expansion. In response, Britain issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, attempting to limit colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists were not thrilled.
because limiting expansion was not exactly fashionable in settler society. Let's float forward a little more. The American Revolution arrives in 1775. 13 colonies rebel against British rule, speaking passionately of liberty and self-determination. Indigenous nations watched carefully. Some sided with the British, calculating that a distant empire might restrain colonial settlers better than a new expansionist republic. Others supported the revolutionaries. Many tried again to remain neutral. But neutrality is difficult when armies march on your lands. After the United States gained independence in 1783, indigenous nations were not invited to the treaty negotiations in Paris. Their lands were discussed, their futures decided without their consent, which set a troubling precedent. The new United States government began signing treaties directly with indigenous nations, recognizing them as sovereign entities, at least in theory. In practice, land cessations increased. In the Southeast, the Cherokee Nation adapted in ways that still surprise people today. They developed a written constitution modeled partly on the U.S. system. They established a bilingual newspaper. They built schools. Sequoyah, a Cherokee silversmith, created a syllabary that allowed the Cherokee language to be written and widely read. Literacy rates soared within the nation. Adaptation was strategic. It was an effort to coexist while maintaining identity. And yet, pressure mounted. By the early 20th century, cotton agriculture had become enormously profitable in the American South. Cotton required land, lots of it, and much of that land belonged to indigenous nations. In 1830, the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act under President Andrew Jackson. The law authorized the forced relocation of indigenous nations east of the Mississippi River to lands further west. It was presented as a solution, a peaceful exchange. It was not peaceful. The Cherokee Nation challenged removal in U.S. courts and even won a Supreme Court case affirming their rights. But enforcement depended on political will. And political will was lacking. The forced marches that followed, including the Cherokee removal in 1838 to 1839, became known collectively as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died of disease, exposure, and exhaustion. It was not a dramatic battlefield clash. It was something slower, quieter, and devastating. Meanwhile, in the Great Plains, life was also transforming. The introduction of horses, originally brought by the Spanish, had reshaped many plains cultures centuries earlier. Nations like the Lakota developed highly mobile societies centered around buffalo hunting. As American settlers pushed westward during the 19th century, conflicts intensified. Treaties were signed and broken. Railroads cut across migration routes. Buffalo populations were decimated, undermining economic foundations. Through all of this, indigenous nations resisted in varied ways, some through diplomacy, some through legal battles, some through armed defense. But tonight, we're not focusing on individual battles. We're observing the broader pattern: expansion, pressure, displacement, and endurance. Because despite disease, removal, warfare, and broken treaties, indigenous peoples did not vanish. Communities rebuilt in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Nations re-established governments. Languages persisted, even under policies that later attempted to suppress them in boarding schools. Cultural survival became an act of quiet resistance. By the late 19th century, U.S. policy shifted again toward assimilation. Communal lands were divided into individual allotments. Boarding schools removed children from families in an effort to erase language and tradition. It was framed as progress. It often felt as erasure. And yet, ceremonies continued in secret. Elders whispered stories. Songs were remembered. The story of Indigenous America in this period is not simply tragedy. It is also continuity, identity carried through impossible circumstances. As we drift toward the 20th century, we begin to see renewed activism, legal challenges, cultural revitalization movements, a refusal to disappear quietly into someone else's narrative. But that we'll ease into next. For now, let the weight of this era settle softly. Expansion and survival, loss and resilience. The continent changed dramatically, but the first peoples of America remained.